Costly signals, what makes you credible? Costly signals, what makes you credible? In the spring of 2017, the British writer Douglas Murray sat for an interview with the Australian journalist Tom Switzer about Murray's recently published book on European migration. The interview, by the standards of contemporary public discourse, was civil. Switzer asked skeptical questions, Murray answered them. They disagreed in places, neither raised his voice. The interview is unremarkable in every respect except one. It is a clinic in costly signal deployment, and the clinic was so reliably useful that Murray's career grew, over the following 5 years, on the strength of dozens of similar interviews in which he did the same thing again. Whenever Switzer challenged a claim, isn't it true that the actual numbers don't bear that out? Murray's response was almost always to give the specific number, the specific source, and the specific date. The Office for National Statistics figure for that year was 318,000. That's a 2015 release. You can find it in the Migration Statistics Quarterly for that quarter. Whenever Switzer reached for a generalization, but most migrants are economic migrants, surely, Murray's response was almost always to give the specific population breakdown, the specific country mix, and the specific routes. The Mediterranean route in 2015 had a different composition than the Balkan route. If you look at the IOM data on that month, the proportions are different by an order of magnitude. This sounds like a small thing. It is not. Switzer is a competent journalist who had read Murray's book before the interview. He should have been able to push back at the level of specific numbers. He could not, because he had not memorized them. Most journalists on most beats have not memorized them. They have an opinion about migration in general with general supporting impressions. Murray had numbers. The asymmetry, and this is the point, was visible to the audience within about 2 minutes. The audience does not need to know who is right. The audience needs to know who has done the work. The signals that demonstrate work has been done are different from the signals that demonstrate opinion has been formed. The first kind are costly. The second kind are cheap. Almost everything in this chapter is about the difference, and about how to send the first kind reliably, and how to recognize the second kind so you do not embarrass yourself by mistaking volume for evidence. The economist Michael Spence won the Nobel Prize in 2001 for working out, in mathematical detail, why some signals carry information and others do not. The work is technical, the principle is simple. A signal carries credible information when the cost of sending it is differentially higher for senders of one type than another, and when the cost is high enough that fakers cannot afford to send it. A university degree is the canonical Spence example. A bachelor's degree, considered as a credential, transmits surprisingly little specific information about what its holder knows. Most jobs the holder will eventually do are unrelated to the content of the degree. The degree's value as a signal lies almost entirely in the fact that obtaining it is much harder for a person who lacks the relevant aptitudes than for a person who has them. The degree is a costly signal of those aptitudes, costly meaning it cannot be faked at scale by people who do not have what it signals. A person who shows up at a job interview claiming to have the aptitudes a degree signals, but who lacks the degree, is sending a cheap signal. He is asking to be believed without paying the cost. He is, in Spence's framework, indistinguishable from the people who are simply lying. The biological literature has the same idea under a different name. The Israeli zoologist Amos Zahavi proposed in 1975 that costly biological displays, the peacock's tail, the gazelle's stoating jump in the presence of a predator, function precisely because they are costly. A peacock with a heavy, conspicuous tail is advertising that he can survive despite the handicap of the tail. Only a peacock with very strong underlying fitness can afford the tail. Peahens, evolved over millions of years to read the signal, mate with the peacocks who have it. The signal is honest because it is expensive. The principle generalizes. In any context where you need to communicate that you are credible, the signals that work are the signals that would be expensive for a non-credible sender to fake. The signals that do not work are the signals that anyone could send. In a debate, the costly signals fall into roughly 7 categories. I will name them in order of increasing power. The first is specificity. In 2015 is more costly than in recent years. On page 412 is more costly than as the literature suggests. In the second quarter of fiscal 2019 is more costly than not long ago. Specificity is costly because it is verifiable. A wrong specific can be checked and refuted, and a sender who is wrong about specifics will be caught. Therefore, senders who give specifics either have done the work or are willing to risk being caught. Either way, the audience updates upward. The second is named instance. Mandana Misra at Mahishmati in approximately 800 CE is more costly than a famous debate in ancient India. The Lincoln-Douglas debate at Freeport in August of 1858 is more costly than Lincoln once asked a question that backfired on his opponent. Named instances are costly because they require historical knowledge that is hard to fake. Almost every named instance is, at minimum, Googleable, and a sender who names a wrong instance can be embarrassed. Senders who routinely name instances are, on the audience's running tally, doing more work than senders who routinely gesture at instances. The third is slowed tempo. The unrushed pace of speech, sentences with subordinate clauses fully developed, pauses between paragraphs, refusal to be hurried by an interrupting interlocutor, is costly because it requires composure. A flooded speaker accelerates. A speaker who is faking composure can sometimes hold an artificially slow tempo for 30 seconds. Almost no one can hold it for 10 minutes under hostile pressure. The sustained slow tempo, therefore, distinguishes the genuinely composed from the temporarily controlled. The audience's mammalian nervous system reads this without conscious analysis. The fourth is admitted limit. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't read the source you're referring to. I'd want to before commenting. That's outside my area of competence. Admitted limits are costly because they are status-reducing in the short term. A debater whose ego is fragile cannot admit them. Therefore, admission of limits is a signal that the debater's ego is not fragile, and not fragile debaters are more credible than fragile ones. The first time you say "I don't know" in a public debate, the audience does not penalize you. The audience updates upward, because most debaters they have ever watched have lied at exactly such a moment, and you have not. The fifth is strategic concession. You're right about that. I was wrong to put it that way. Let me restate. That objection lands. I'll have to rethink the position. Strategic concession is costly because it is publicly status-reducing in the short term, but it is differentially affordable to debaters who are genuinely interested in the truth, and prohibitively costly to debaters who are interested only in winning. The audience reads this distinction within seconds. We will spend an entire chapter on strategic concession later, because it is the most powerful single move in the costly signal repertoire. The sixth is named cost. I voted for that policy, and it was a mistake. I argued for the opposite position 5 years ago, and the events since have changed my mind. I am about to say something that will make my friends uncomfortable. Named cost is costly because it stakes something specific that the audience can verify. A debater who claims, in the abstract, to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads is sending a cheap signal. A debater who names the specific position they previously held and then changed is sending a costly one. The cost is the public admission of having been wrong in a specific way by name. The seventh, and the most expensive of the 7, is publicly observable behavior over time. The columnist who has, year after year, broken with their political tribe on specific issues. The academic who has, year after year, published papers that contradicted their reputation. The lawyer who has, year after year, defended unpopular clients on principle. The signal is the track record. The signal cannot be sent in a single debate. It can only be referenced. But when it can be referenced, when the audience can verify by independent investigation that the speaker has paid the costly signal repeatedly over a long period, the credibility update is enormous. Hitchens's reputation in his last 10 years was built almost entirely on this kind of signal. Almost everyone who came to him to debate religion knew, within the first 60 seconds, that the man across the table had broken with the political left on specific issues, named repeatedly over 20 years. They did not have to take his word for anything, because his record was the word. The cheap signals, the signals that transmit nothing and that mark the sender, often within minutes, as someone who has not done the work, also fall into a small number of categories. There is volume, speaking loudly, speaking quickly, speaking for a long time without pausing. None of this transmits competence. All of it can be done by someone who has nothing specific to say. There is credentials without deployment. As a Harvard-trained economist, I would say that, without any of the specific economic content, a Harvard-trained economist would in fact say, the credential is mentioned, the work the credential should produce is absent. The audience reads the absence. The credential, in this deployment, becomes evidence against the speaker rather than for them. There is generic applause line, sentences that are designed to receive nodding and clapping, but that do not commit the speaker to anything specific or testable. We need to follow the science. We need to have a national conversation. Working families deserve better. These are signals that the speaker is willing to be applauded. They are not signals that the speaker has anything to say. There is appeal to consensus without specifics. Most experts agree. Scientific community has reached a consensus on this. These can be costly signals, but only when they are followed by the specifics. The relevant meta-analyses are X, Y, and Z, and the convergent finding is N that demonstrate the speaker has actually read the consensus literature. Without the specifics, the appeal is cheap, and the audience reads it as cheap. There is moral framing as substitute for argument. It's wrong that, we should be ashamed that, decent people would never. These are evaluative claims, which can be appropriate when the evaluative claim is the point at issue. They are cheap when they are deployed in place of the factual or definitional work that the dispute actually requires. A general principle, any signal that could be sent equally easily by someone who knows nothing about the topic is a cheap signal. Signals that work are the ones a non-knower could not send without immediate embarrassment. When Adi Shankaracharya walked into Mandana Misra's house in Mahishmati for the 8-day debate, the very first thing he did, before any object-level argument, was send the most costly signal available to him. He conceded the entire ritual machinery. This was not a small concession. Mandana was a Mimamsa philosopher whose life was organized around the daily, hourly ritual practice of the Vedic tradition. The morning rites, the evening rites, the precise sequencing of mantras, the specific implements, the lifelong discipline of doing each correctly. Mandana's entire scholarly reputation, his social position, his marriage, his household, were constructed within and around this practice. To concede the practice's value was, for any opponent, the costliest possible opening. Shankara conceded it. Yes, he said, in essence, though I am compressing 8 days of subtle and elaborate Sanskrit dialectic into a sentence, yes, the rituals you perform produce real and important benefits. They purify the mind. They settle the disposition. They prepare the practitioner for the contemplative life. They are not optional. They are not unimportant. They are not, as some Vedantins have suggested, mere superstition. They produce chitta-shuddhi, mental purification, and chitta-shuddhi is a real and necessary precondition. This concession cost Shankara almost nothing in the substance of his eventual case, because his case was not that ritual was worthless. His case was that ritual could not produce moksha, which is a separate claim. But the concession cost him a great deal in the perception of the audience, who watched him concede ground that everyone in the room had expected him to defend. The audience watching this updated immediately and decisively. The young sannyasi was not a sectarian. The young sannyasi was not here to attack the Mimamsa school. The young sannyasi was here to argue on the merits about a specific question, the question of what produces moksha, and was prepared to grant his opponent every adjacent point that could be granted. This is what costly signaling looks like before any object-level argument has been made. The 8-day debate after this opening was effectively a contest between an opponent who had been positioned by the room as the sectarian, because Mandana's defenses of ritual were now defending what Shankara had already conceded, which made them look defensive, and a young challenger who had been positioned by the room as the open-minded inquirer, because his costly concession had established him as such within the first hour. When the audience watched Shankara win on the third day, they were not watching a victory of arguments over arguments. They were watching the consequence of a costly signal asymmetry that had been established before the arguments began. This is what Mandana lost on. He never got the chance to fight on the substance, because the costly signal contest had been decided before substance arrived. The audit will feel uncomfortable the first time. Most people, even professionals who have made a living from public argument, have spent more of their public output on cheap signals than they realize. The audit is the diagnostic that allows the upgrade. The upgrade is one of the highest leverage moves you can make for your own credibility.